Why was one of America's most powerful prosecutors suddenly fired by email just days after convicting Diddy? The answer connects Trump, Epstein, and a conspiracy bigger than anyone expected. Stop scrolling. A prosecutor who took down Epstein, Maxwell, and Diddy was fired overnight. No warning, no explanation, just one cryptic line. Article 2. What does that really mean? They silenced the one woman who dared to take on Epstein, Maxwell, and Diddy. But the real question is, who wanted her gone, and why now? Epstein's secrets, Maxwell's conviction, Diddy's downfall. She led them all, and then, out of nowhere, she was fired. This story isn't about justice anymore. It's about power. I don't usually dive into drama, but this story is too big to ignore. Today, we're talking about Maurene Comey, the daughter of former FBI Director James Comey, who was suddenly fired from her position as a top federal prosecutor. And trust me, the reasons behind her removal connect some of the most powerful and controversial names in America: Diddy, Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and even Donald Trump. Now, Maurene wasn't just another lawyer. For nearly a decade, she was one of the Southern District of New York's strongest prosecutors. She built a reputation as the person you called when the government needed results. More than 200 convictions, countless high-profile cases, and praise from judges and supervisors alike. If there was a star prosecutor role, she filled it. Her work first caught the nation's attention in 2019, when she stepped into one of the most notorious cases of the decade, the indictment of Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was no ordinary defendant. He was a wealthy financier with deep political connections, friendships with celebrities, and access to the world's elite. For years, rumors had swirled about his private island, his lavish parties, and the disturbing young women who seemed to surround him wherever he went. But until 2019, those whispers had never turned into real consequences. That all changed when federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York finally brought charges of sex trafficking against him, and Maurene Comey was one of the prosecutors leading the charge. Unlike many others in her position, Maurene refused to be intimidated by Epstein's money, influence, or the powerful friends who quietly defended him. While some expected the case to fizzle out or be quietly settled, she pushed hard to keep him behind bars before trial. That fight was no small task. Epstein had the resources to hire the best defense lawyers in the country, and his team argued aggressively for his release. But Maurene stood firm, insisting that someone accused of such serious crimes involving the exploitation of minors, should not be free to return to his mansion while awaiting judgment. It was a battle that highlighted both her legal skill and her moral determination. Then, almost as quickly as the case began, it took a shocking turn. Epstein was found dead in his jail cell, in what authorities called a suicide, but millions questioned as something darker. His sudden death left many of his victims devastated, convinced they had been robbed of their day in court. It also left the prosecutors in an unusual position, without their main defendant, but with a mountain of evidence suggesting there was more to the story. For Maurene Comey, Epstein's death was not the end of the fight. She pivoted her attention to the woman many considered his closest partner in crime, Ghislaine Maxwell. For years, Maxwell had lived in the shadows, accused of recruiting and grooming young women for Epstein's trafficking operation. To some, she was his social connector. To others, she was his enabler. Whatever her role, prosecutors believed she was deeply involved in the abuse that had gone on for years. In 2021, the case against Maxwell went to trial, and once again Maurene was front and center. It was one of the most closely watched trials of the decade, drawing global attention and sparking heated debates about wealth, privilege, and accountability. Maxwell was represented by an expensive legal team that tried to paint her as a scapegoat, a woman unfairly blamed for Epstein's sins simply because he was no longer alive to face justice. But Maurene and her team built a powerful case, piece by piece. Witnesses came forward, telling harrowing stories of being lured by promises of modeling opportunities or mentorship, only to find themselves trapped in Epstein's orbit. Flight logs, photographs, and records backed up their claims. Throughout the trial, Maurene displayed the calm but relentless style that had earned her a reputation as one of the Southern District's strongest prosecutors. She kept the focus on the victims, making sure their voices were heard in a courtroom that for so long had silenced them. In December 2021, the jury returned its verdict: guilty. Maxwell was convicted on multiple counts, including sex trafficking of minors, and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. For many of Epstein's survivors, The verdict was not only a measure of justice, but also a moment of vindication. Someone had finally been held accountable, even if the man at the center of the scandal had escaped judgment through his death. Maurene's role in that victory did not go unnoticed. Legal experts, journalists, and advocates all pointed to her as one of the key figures who made the case stick. It wasn't just about securing a conviction, it was about holding powerful people to the same standard as everyone else, something that many critics said had been missing in the Epstein saga for decades. The Maxwell trial cemented Maurene's reputation as more than just another federal prosecutor. She had become a symbol of accountability in cases where the odds seemed stacked against ordinary justice. And it also made her a target. Taking on Epstein and Maxwell meant taking on a world of influence, wealth, and powerful connections. It meant digging into files that could potentially expose people who would rather stay in the shadows. It meant challenging systems that, for years, had quietly protected the rich and powerful from the consequences of their actions. For Maurene, however, it was never about fame or recognition. Those who worked with her described her as disciplined, understated, and deeply committed to the principle that no one should be above the law. She wasn't seeking the spotlight. She was simply doing her job, and doing it exceptionally well. Yet, as history shows, when a prosecutor takes on cases that reach into the highest levels of power, their work rarely goes unchallenged. The Epstein and Maxwell prosecutions were just the beginning of the challenges Maurene would face. They showcased her skills, her resilience, and her refusal to be intimidated. But they also put her on a collision course with forces far outside the courtroom, political figures, media personalities, and networks of influence that would later play a role in one of the most shocking turns of her career: her sudden and unexplained firing. Still, looking back at 2019 and 2021, it's clear that those years were defining moments. They revealed who Maurene Comey was not just as a lawyer, but as someone willing to stand firm in the pursuit of justice, no matter how powerful the opposition might be. Fast forward to 2024, and the spotlight shifted once again, this time toward one of the most recognizable figures in music and entertainment, Sean "Diddy" Combs. For decades, Diddy had built an empire as a rapper, producer, entrepreneur, and cultural icon. But behind the music and celebrity branding, investigators claimed there was a much darker reality. Federal prosecutors charged him with racketeering, sex trafficking, and prostitution, painting a picture of a sprawling criminal operation hidden beneath the glitz and glamour of his public life. When the Southern District of New York decided who would take the lead in this massive case, they knew they needed someone who could handle the weight of a trial that would dominate headlines and test the limits of the justice system. Once again, they turned to Maurene Comey. By then, she was already battle-tested. She had taken down Ghislaine Maxwell in the aftermath of Epstein's death. She had proved she could stand toe-to-toe with high-priced defense teams representing powerful people. She had shown she wouldn't fold under pressure. So, in May 2025, Maurene stepped into the courtroom as lead prosecutor in what quickly became one of the most high-profile trials of the year. The case was as complex as it was controversial. The government accused Diddy of running a network that exploited women, facilitated illegal activities, and used his wealth and influence to shield himself from consequences. The defense, meanwhile, painted him as the victim of overzealous prosecutors and political motivations. Every day, the trial drew crowds outside the courthouse and endless commentary online, with fans, critics, and the media dissecting every development. For Maurene, the courtroom was familiar territory. Calm and methodical, she presented the government's case with precision. Witnesses took the stand, sharing troubling accounts of abuse and manipulation. Financial records, communications, and testimony painted a portrait of a man whose public persona as a mogul and mentor masked private actions that prosecutors argued were criminal. The charges of racketeering, the same statute often used against organized crime families, carried particularly high stakes. If the jury convicted on those counts, it would mean they believed Diddy was not just an individual making bad choices, but the leader of a broader criminal enterprise. Diddy's defense team fought back fiercely. They argued that the government was overreaching, trying to make an example out of a celebrity. They suggested the witnesses were unreliable or motivated by money and attention. They pushed the narrative that prosecutors like Maurene were driven by politics rather than justice. Every move she made in court was scrutinized, not only by the defense across the aisle, but also by the public watching from afar. The trial stretched from May into July, with tension building as the jury deliberated. When the verdict finally came down, it was a mix of victory and frustration for the prosecution. The jury found Diddy guilty, but not on the sweeping RICO charges that prosecutors had hoped would define the case. Instead, he was convicted on other serious counts, including sex trafficking and related offenses, leaving him facing a possible 20-year prison sentence. On one hand, it was a major win. Few had ever imagined that someone with Diddy's level of fame and fortune would face such accountability. On the other, missing the RICO conviction meant the government didn't succeed in proving the broader criminal enterprise they believed existed. Some called it a partial victory, others said it was still a powerful message that even cultural icons are not untouchable. For Maurene, the outcome reflected the reality of high-stakes prosecution. Victories are rarely absolute. The courtroom is unpredictable, and juries sometimes surprise both sides. What mattered most was that the government had secured a conviction and held one of the most powerful men in entertainment accountable for crimes tied to abuse and exploitation. But the aftermath of the trial brought more than just headlines about Diddy's future. It also brought an unexpected turn in Maurene's own career. Only days after the conviction, while the world was still dissecting what the verdict meant for Diddy, Maurene received shocking news. She was abruptly fired from her position, with no warning and no explanation. It was a decision that blindsided not only her but also her colleagues, many of whom saw her as one of the office's most skilled and reliable prosecutors. The timing raised eyebrows everywhere. Why remove the prosecutor who had just helped secure a conviction in one of the most closely watched cases in recent history? Why dismiss someone with a spotless record and glowing reviews? To many observers, it didn't look like coincidence. It looked like politics. The Diddy case had once again shown Maurene's ability to take on powerful figures and navigate high-pressure trials. But it had also placed her directly in the crosshairs of political battles that extended far beyond the courtroom. Her success in exposing corruption and abuse made her an asset to the justice system, but it also made her a target for those who viewed her work as threatening. As Diddy now awaits sentencing, facing the possibility of spending up to 20 years behind bars, Maurene is fighting a battle of her own. Her firing has sparked debates not just about her career, but about the independence of the Department of Justice, the influence of politics on prosecutions, and whether even the most skilled and dedicated prosecutors can be pushed out when their work collides with powerful interests. In the end, the 2024 to 2025 Diddy trial became more than a legal showdown. It was a test of justice against fame, money, and influence. For Maurene Comey, it was both a professional victory and a personal turning point, one that showed the world her strength in the courtroom and the cost of standing at the center of cases that shake the foundations of power. Then everything changed. Just days after the conclusion of the Diddy trial, on July 16, 2025, Maurene Comey's career took a shocking and unexpected turn. Sitting in her office, she received an email that would alter the course of her professional life. It was short, cold, and impersonal. She was terminated from her position. No explanation. No prior warning. No mention of poor performance. The memo cited only one thing: Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, the section that outlines the powers of the president. For Maurene, it was a gut punch. After years of dedicated service, after some of the most high-profile prosecutions of the decade, she was suddenly cast aside without even a conversation. Her colleagues were just as stunned. Supervisors who had reviewed her work only months earlier had given her the highest possible marks. She was widely regarded as one of the office's most skilled and reliable prosecutors, someone who could be trusted to handle the toughest cases. Now, without warning, she was out. The shock was amplified by the fact that she was the only one dismissed. Out of the team of prosecutors who had worked on cases involving Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and most recently Sean Diddy Combs, Maurene alone was shown the door. To those who had followed her career, the timing seemed more than suspicious. Why her? Why now? Almost immediately, speculation turned to politics. Maurene's father, former FBI Director James Comey, had been a longtime target of Donald Trump's anger. Ever since Trump fired him in 2017, he had lashed out at Comey repeatedly, calling him a liar, a criminal, and the worst FBI director in history. Trump had posted hundreds of times about him on social media, keeping the feud alive for years. To many observers, Maurene's firing looked less like a personnel decision and more like retaliation by association. The memo's vague reference to Article 2 seemed to confirm that this was not about job performance, but presidential authority. Technically, the president has the power to remove federal prosecutors, but federal law also provides protections against firing career civil servants for purely political reasons. That's why the decision raised alarms. If Maurene could be dismissed despite her spotless record and long track record of success, what did that mean for the independence of the Justice Department? Her colleagues described the atmosphere as one of disbelief. Some whispered about what this would mean for ongoing investigations, especially those connected to Epstein's network. Others worried about the precedent it set, that even the most accomplished prosecutors could be discarded if their family name or political associations were inconvenient. For many, the firing wasn't just about Maurene, it was about whether justice itself could remain free from political interference. Crediting Trump's new Attorney General Pam Bondi, this wasn't about performance, it was about political revenge. Now, Maurene is fighting back. She has filed a lawsuit against the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, and the Executive Office of the President, arguing that her firing violated the Constitution. She says it was retaliation for her father's speech, not her own work, and she's demanding reinstatement along with damages. If she wins, her case could set a major precedent on whether politics can cost federal prosecutors their jobs. And what about Diddy? His conviction still stands, and sentencing is right around the corner. Regardless of the chaos surrounding Maurene Comey, he still faces up to 20 years in prison. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Yes, Diddy was convicted, but the story doesn't end there. Once he's sentenced, his legal team will almost certainly file an appeal. That's standard, but don't be surprised if they try to argue that political interference inside the Department of Justice made his trial unfair. The problem for them is that appeals are usually based on trial errors, not staffing decisions. Still, Diddy's defense has shown they're willing to throw every argument possible at the wall, hoping something sticks. And politics absolutely played a role in Maurene Comey's firing. The very cases that made her a respected prosecutor, Epstein, Maxwell, and now Diddy, were turned against her by Trump's allies. Laura Loomer, who spearheaded the campaign to remove her, name-dropped those exact cases to paint Maurene as part of the so-called deep state. This raises bigger concerns too. Not all of Epstein's files have been made public, and some names remain sealed. The Southern District of New York was still investigating connections even after Maxwell's conviction. With Maurene gone, those investigations may slow down. Decisions about which files to release could now be influenced by politics, and defense lawyers for Epstein's associates will likely use her firing as evidence of bias in the DOJ. That's why Maurene Comey has such a strong case. Her record speaks for itself: outstanding reviews, high-profile convictions, and years of service. Yet, she was the only prosecutor suddenly fired by email, with no explanation, just a reference to Article 2 of the Constitution. Federal law is supposed to protect career prosecutors from political retaliation, and her complaint highlights exactly that. She points to clear evidence: the timing, the political pressure, Loomer bragging online about forcing her termination, and Trump's long history of attacking her father, James Comey. Her legal team filed a 39-page complaint in federal court, laying out claims of retaliation and due process violations. The DOJ, of course, will argue that presidents have the authority to remove U.S. attorneys under Article 2. But Maurene's track record and the political paper trail make her case hard to dismiss. So, here's the big question. What do you think? Was this truly about performance or pure politics? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I want to hear from you. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next update.